American Maritime Voices was created to help you speak up, show your pride, and when needed, push back. The future of maritime is in your hands, and its story needs to be told. Will you help tell it?
Welcome back to the American Maritime Podcast. We're glad to have you aboard. I'm your host, Sada Fuentes, and today we are honored to have Rear Admiral Peter Brown, a senior fellow for Western Hemisphere Security and Maritime Affairs for the America First Policy Institute. Prior to joining AFPI, Admiral Brown oversaw the U.S. Coast Guard's 7th District, directing operations across the Southeast United States and the Caribbean. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So why don't we start off by introducing you to our audience and tell us a little bit about your career from the Coast Guard to AFPI.
Well, my career has been super interesting, and it's really more than a story about me. It's a story of American opportunity. And it's interesting because my wife and I have almost the same root pattern, where our parents and grandparents are immigrants who came from another country, in my case, Ireland, in my wife's case, Dominican Republic, moved to New York City, met there, and then I got to go to the Coast Guard Academy basically because a high school guidance counselor suggested it to me. I was looking at West Point and Annapolis, and he said, "Hey, there's a Coast Guard Academy too, why don't you look at that?" And I went there to visit and said, I think that's for me. The mission is super appealing. And then my first tour was out of San Juan, Puerto Rico.
Oh, beautiful.
On a ship station there. And from there, I had kind of, in some ways, a standard seagoing career. I moved up, through the ranks into different positions on board. But the other part that was like super interesting was that there were jobs that developed while I was in the service that didn't exist when I first joined. As a 17-year-old, walking through the gates and marching on a parade field for the first time, you can't see all the opportunity in front of you. But then looking back, now that I'm 60 plus something, looking back on it, the opportunities were tremendous. So I went from walking onto the parade field to walking on the lawn of the White House next to the president as his Homeland Security advisor. And that's an opportunity, and it's there for everybody who joins the military. It's really there in different ways for everybody in America. The opportunity to get an education, to work, and to advance American security and prosperity.
Yeah, it's really a classic kind of American dream, right? Your family moved here for a better opportunity. You worked hard, and you really kind of got to the highest peaks working with the president.
Yeah, in fact, after one meeting with the president, I called up my mom, and I said, "Hey, Mom, you've made it." And she's like, "What do you mean I've made it?" And I said, "Well, you moved
did all the
here,
work."
and your son just met with the president and vice president in the Oval Office."
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Really incredible. I'm sure she's very proud.
Yeah.
And then thinking about your most recent position in the Coast Guard, looking at that sector, kind of Southeast United States, Caribbean, and Western U.S., what are kind of those security threats that are in that area?
So one of the things that's really fascinating about that district, we used to call it the 7th District, now it's the Southeast District, and I got to work there at every pay grade, in part because I speak enough Spanish that they kept recycling me to the Caribbean. But the part that I find most interesting is we've got 34 different next-door neighbors in the Caribbean, and every one of them we have a maritime connection with. Right. So and every one of them has interests in the maritime environment that match up with something that the Coast Guard does. It might be counter-drug, it might be migrants, it might be environmental. And the drugs and migrants are kind of the most visible, I'd say, symptoms. Right. But really it's criminality, lawlessness, sometimes in the military we call it ungoverned spaces, corruption. And they're really the disease. The drugs and migrants are kind of the symptom. And every one of those neighbors has a connection with the Coast Guard, even Cuba, who obviously politically we don't agree with. We've had a Coast Guard officer stationed in Cuba for more than 20 years because interaction, even with an adversary, on stuff that we can agree about, we want to keep people safe, we want to stop drugs from flowing, even that can work. And that was another one of those interesting opportunities. Never knew when I was coming in that I'd be doing that. Right. But that was one of those roles.
Right, fascinating. And then thinking about that region too, what we're seeing lately is China having more and more of an influence there with our closest neighbors. What are the implications and national security implications of China's presence in kind of that southeastern region?
Wow, sometimes they're not very visible, but together they add up to a concerted campaign by the People's Republic of China to, in some ways, supplant the United States as a dominant world power, economic, maritime, military, diplomatic. And that there's evidence of that already in Central America, the Caribbean, South America. So particularly the Pacific-facing countries of South and Central America, there's tremendous pressure from China for trade deals. China finances, but in a very unfriendly way.
Right.
Infrastructure deals, their Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah.
But their fishing fleets also press up against the coast. For example, the Galapagos Islands off of Ecuador. But even closer to home, in the Bahamas, China has done a lot of infrastructure work there, but they do it in ways that are really not helpful to that country. So, for example, they use Chinese workers, Chinese financing.
Right,
and,
so not a lot of benefit to the local community.
Right, and then they also create strategic vulnerability to us. So, for example, a Chinese company owns what was the British Colonial Hilton right across the street from the U.S. Embassy in Nassau in the Bahamas. When they do electronic upgrades, we know that they're trying to exploit communications coming off that embassy, guests who are there who are going to the embassy, and things like that. Also, the Bahamas are in the flight path of everything that launches out of Cape Canaveral. And so the Chinese are monitoring that from facilities in the Bahamas. So it's there, it is pervasive, and thankfully with Secretary Rubio and the current administration in place, the U.S. is paying a lot more attention in the Western Hemisphere than we had been for decades.
Yeah, it really sounds like it. You know, you mentioned earlier, too, all the changes happening with the Coast Guard. So what role do you see for emerging technologies that we're seeing now, right? AI, drones, all of this affecting the Coast Guard, strengthening it, creating new challenges?
Yeah. So one of the things that I got to do a side hustle, so to speak, in the Coast Guard was, and this is back in the 90s, so it's ancient history in terms of technology now, but it was cutting edge at the time, was we started using analytical chemistry that we could take to sea, electronic instruments that could find cocaine that was hidden on ships or on the hands and clothing of crew members on ships. I had a chemistry background, so that got to be my fun project, and we're still using it. Those same devices you see at the airports now, at TSA check stations. So that kind of technology will always be coming out. The way I think about a lot of things in the security lane and in others is it's a combination of enduring truth, we need a Coast Guard, evolving tactics, exactly how we operate is going to change, and emerging technology. I think the one that's kind of the most obvious, it's analogous to weather forecasting. So remote and persistent surveillance of the water, both the surface of the water and the water space, combined with AI-based anomaly detection, is going to allow us to do things a lot more efficiently and effectively. So, for example, in the Coast Guard, we like to say we want to take the search out of search and rescue. Right? If we know precisely where somebody is, send a helicopter right there. You don't have to go really looking for them. And I think AI and this remote surveillance capabilities has a lot to offer in that regard. One of the things I'd often tell officers on a ship is, I'm training you so that you know when something is not quite right before it goes terribly wrong. AI has the ability to tell us when something is not quite right before it goes terribly wrong. Again, think about it in terms of weather forecasting now, the ability for tornado warnings to be based not on seeing a tornado, but on the conditions for the formation of a tornado to be detected in a certain place at a certain time.
Right, right. Fascinating. And I know Coast Guard has so much data, right? You guys are analyzing so much and taking in so much information that the ability to quickly synthesize and make it actionable has got to be a really exciting time for
Yeah, and so
FPI.
the Coast Guard has put together a team now. I think they're calling it Raptor. It's a Rapid Innovation Cell at Coast Guard headquarters. It's headed up by a guy who's literally a shipmate of mine, a guy I sailed with a few years ago.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Welcome to American Maritime Voices, your place to be heard. As part of American Maritime, you are critical to moving and securing our country. And now you can help tell the story of maritime and be part of key decisions that affect it. American Maritime Voices was created to help you speak up, show your pride, and when needed, push back. It's free to become a voice, and we'll keep you informed of what's happening in Washington, so you can help change the course of issues that matter most to you. As a voice, you'll get monthly updates, have access to podcasts and videos, and receive action alerts when your voice is needed most. The future of maritime is in your hands, and its story needs to be told. Will you help tell it?
And so the Coast Guard is very beloved by Congress. We were, just a couple of weeks ago, we were celebrating the Coast Guard's birthday on Capitol Hill, and the heroes from Kerrville were there. And I think they got a photo with every single member of Congress that was there. Everyone's really grateful to them. But, people really only think about the Coast Guard when it's kind of that rescue moment or that hero moment. What else about the Coast Guard is misunderstood among policymakers, or that you wish that they understood more?
Well, you mentioned Congress, and I have to mention two absolute champions for the Coast Guard in Congress, and they're Senator Rick Scott and Congressman Brian Mast, both from Florida. And they understand, and their teams understand better than most, that the Coast Guard is a military service, but it's in DHS, not DOD. So sometimes legislative efforts accidentally kind of miss the Coast Guard if they're embedded in DOD-focused legislation. So it takes some effort on the part of the staffs and the drafters and the committees to make sure that happens right. So that's one. And again, those two in particular do a great job in that regard. I think the other one is that most people, when they think about the Coast Guard, they think of, they think we're inside of the beach all the time, almost like the old TV show Baywatch, right? Everything happens
Everyone's in there
right
monitoring
there.
the binoculars.
Well, the truth of the matter is that the U.S. has an exclusive economic zone that stretches across 14 time zones, from the U.S. Virgin Islands all the way to Guam, right? And then from north of the Arctic Circle above Alaska to south of the equator at Samoa. And it's all within 200 miles of the United States, but it's not all together. It's 13 different kind of patches of exclusive economic zone that add up to 15% larger than the entire landmass of the United States. The Coast Guard needs long range, long endurance capability that can get to those places to ensure that we have surveillance, that we have sovereignty, that we have governance over that water space and the activities that take place in it.
Yeah, that's really, when you put it in scale like that, it does sound really massive. And the Coast Guard personnel is pretty small, right? Smaller than the size of NYPD. To cover all of that is really impressive.
It is. And you think about it, if we have, maybe a dozen of our major cutters on the water on a particular day, there might be one theoretically in each patch of exclusive economic zone. It's a huge area. And I'll give you one more example of a great case that I had on a ship I commanded out of California. We left San Diego on patrol, counter-drug patrol. We ended up intercepting a drug trafficking vessel 1,000 miles west of the Galapagos Islands. So down the Galapagos are already 600 miles west of Ecuador, another 1,000 miles west of that. We're 1,500 miles south of San Diego. We're literally in the middle of nowhere, and yet we're enforcing U.S. law because centuries ago, the drafters of the Constitution had the vision to give the Congress power to define and punish piracies and felonies on the high seas. And then they put in place a revenue cutter service originally built to enforce tariffs, the original funding source of our country. And that revenue cutter service morphed into a multi-mission United States Coast Guard whose job remains to be what Alexander Hamilton called useful sentinels of the law, and to do it everywhere that the U.S. has maritime interest.
It's a great history and great tradition. And so you're giving me a very good segue over into the Jones Act, talking about enforcing maritime law on the high seas and the importance of enforcing American laws on our waterways. So obviously the Jones Act requires goods moved between two U.S. points to go on U.S. flagged, U.S. built, U.S. crewed vessels. And we often describe it as the foundation of America's maritime power.
Yeah.
How do you see its role in supporting United States national security?
Well, it's absolutely vital, and it supports national security in two different ways. They interact with each other. One of them is the actual construction of our Navy and Coast Guard vessels, right? The ships that we need come from U.S. shipyards, right? And the Jones Act helps to protect the viability of those shipyards. And then the other part of it is that in times of, particularly in times of national emergency, the ability to move vital supplies, whether it's between U.S. ports or to an overseas location, relies on U.S. flagged, U.S. crewed ships. That helps preserve our national security. And so I like to go back, we've already talked a little bit about Alexander Hamilton and the Federalist Papers and the Constitution. So we mentioned tariffs and the Coast Guard being born really to enforce tariffs. The tariffs not only funded the U.S. government at its founding, but also were designed to ensure that U.S. industry built up. And in fact, when Alexander Hamilton created the Revenue Cutter Service and the Revenue Marine Act, one of the requirements was that the first 10 ships to be built were going to be built in 10 different colonies, so that employment and the capability was in all different places, so we didn't become reliant on just one pocket of excellence to provide for that. So the Jones Act is a natural progression of those ideas brought into the 20th century, and now the Ships Act proposed in the Senate is going to kind of move forward with that, as you described. We'll build on the foundation that already exists in the Jones Act.
Yeah, interesting. And also, the Jones Act and the Coast Guard have a special almost relationship, right? Because when we say U.S. flag, that means, and U.S. crewed, that means those mariners are, have to pass Coast Guard exams. Those vessels are known to the Coast Guard. So there's this kind of extra safety feature in that the Coast Guard is aware of the background of those U.S. vessels on U.S. waters. So what do you think would be the consequences for the Coast Guard specifically, and then maybe for the nation writ large, if the Jones Act were to go away? Is that a lot more work for the Coast Guard if you have?
Wow, it would make some aspects of the work more difficult. The real problem is that over time it would erode the ability to even have a Coast Guard, because the shipbuilding aspect of it is, without it, I mean, you don't have a Coast Guard. And so even now, the number of shipyards that are capable of building ships of the size, type, and complexity that the Coast Guard and the Navy needs, that number has been shrinking over time as shipbuilding has moved to other countries, typically cheaper, less regulated, and in some cases like China, an economic adversary of ours. So the work would get harder, and over time would become near impossible without U.S. shipbuilding and a robust maritime industry, both of which are supported by the Jones Act.
Yeah, and also that maritime border security as well. We talked about migrants earlier. That maritime border is almost as important as any land border we have, and that Jones Act really reinforces and makes sure that we have a strong maritime border too.
Absolutely, and a lot of the shipping, domestic shipping, takes place on our rivers, and so we have on the Mississippi River, Missouri, and others. There are barges and ships and tugs going up and down all the time, literally in the heartland of the country. Right now, they're crewed by Americans. If the Jones Act were to go away, that would rapidly change. They'd be crewed by people we don't necessarily know.
Right. Right, exactly. I always think about the Chinese air balloon a couple years ago and how freaked out everyone got about that, and thinking about that on our waterways and the amount of traffic on our waterways, I think it would just be unacceptable.
Yeah, and it's not just Chinese ships, it's also the cranes. A lot of the cranes in our ports, and there are some cyber vulnerabilities associated with them that the Coast Guard ends up having a role to play in the cybersecurity of our ports as well.
Right. They've been a real leading actor on kind of discovering those vulnerabilities in the cranes and leading that investigation. And so the Coast Guard's cyber intelligence units have really done a remarkable job on leading the way in terms of opening America's eyes to those vulnerabilities. Interesting. Let's turn to Puerto Rico.
Okay.
You were the White House's point person for Puerto Rico disaster recovery during the president's first term. Yeah. What did you see about how the Jones Act helped with recovery, and what information was spread about the Jones Act during that first term?
Okay, so let's start with Puerto Rico kind of on a day-to-day basis, where it's primarily economically supplied by Jones Act vessels operating primarily out of Jacksonville. There are about 3 different companies that end up supplying about 90% of goods that go to Puerto Rico on a recurring basis. And then after a disaster like Hurricane Maria that hit just about now, September of 2017, then those companies rapidly increased their capacity. They not only brought ships from other ports, but they even started basically launching goods from other ports to get to Puerto Rico to provide immediate needs: food, water, construction materials, and also generators, and also crews and trucks to work particularly the electricity grid. The challenge at the time was not a lack of will, a lack of interest, or a lack of shipping capacity. It was bottlenecks in the ports and the roadway systems, which had been so badly damaged by the hurricanes. And so the Jones Act, I think, incorrectly took some of the blame for the challenges that Puerto Rico had in the immediate response. And those companies, the Tote, Crowley, Trailer Bridge, they kept a sustained high level of effort toward Puerto Rico for years to follow. So I was the district commander for the Coast Guard during that time. We have significant facilities and people in Puerto Rico. And so we were working very hard not only to sustain Coast Guard operations, but also to sustain and rebuild Coast Guard infrastructure and bring family members back to Puerto Rico after they'd been evacuated. So I had a personal, and the Coast Guard retains a professional stake in the recovery of Puerto Rico. And then later on, after both a political crisis and then a series of earthquakes on top of the challenges created by the hurricane and Puerto Rico's bankruptcy, then the president asked me to take over essentially some interagency coordination. A lot of people think that FEMA is the big dog in terms of disaster recovery, and they are, but they're not the only one. In fact, we had about a dozen different federal agencies, from HUD, Transportation, Army Corps of Engineers, and others, doing work and expending federal funds in Puerto Rico. And it wasn't always coordinated very well with each other, and sometimes wasn't coordinated well with the government of Puerto Rico. So my job there was to work with the government of Puerto Rico and with these federal agencies to get everybody kind of moving in the right direction. And I often describe that job there as daily happy dissatisfaction. Happy that we're moving in the right direction, right. Dissatisfied that we're not moving fast enough. But we had a solid team there, and we really got things moving in the right way. The congressional rep for Puerto Rico at the time, Jennifer Gonzalez-Colon, is now the governor, and she continues to be a huge supporter of this administration, and is hoping to get things moving in the right direction, particularly with the electricity grid.
Yeah, she seems really focused on that electric grid, because that's kind of a real base level thing. It's hard to make anything else work if that electricity is not reliable, which is a real challenge.
And they've got a number of challenges. Some of them are financial related. Some of them are kind of more related to history and some employment patterns there, and frankly, bad political promises that have been made over a series of decades. That literally, there are some promises that can't be kept from a financial standpoint, and they're going to have to figure out what to do about it.
Yeah. But those natural disasters, like you said, it was just a real triple whammy of hurricane, earthquake, and then the difficulties with that inland transportation made everything really a really challenging environment, even for the Coast Guard.
And Puerto Rico's 1,000 miles away from Miami, so when there's a problem, it's going to take some time, effort, and frankly expense to get relief there. Yeah. And it's got to be maritime. Airports are very photogenic, and I certainly learned this. When the earthquake hit Haiti, again, I was on the 7th District staff in Miami, and the airports are photogenic, but it takes ships to feed an island nation.
Yeah, if you really need to move volume, you gotta go by vessel. But yeah, that was a real tragedy, and Puerto Rico is such a jewel and so beautiful that it's I'm sure we're all very grateful to you all for working so hard on it.
I lived there for a few years. I worked there frequently in the Coast Guard. I visit fairly often. I was able to go to the governor's inauguration earlier this year. So yeah, it's got a special place for me.
That's wonderful. And so we do hear a lot from some critics that the Jones Act hurts Puerto Rico. What would you say to those critics?
Well, the first thing is on a purely economic basis, the additional cost. And remember, again, Puerto Rico is an island 1,000 miles from Miami, and more like 1,200 by sea from Jacksonville. And on an island, things are going to be more expensive because everything has to be imported from somewhere. Different estimates, assess the Jones Act premium for Puerto Rico anywhere from negligible to about $300 to $500 per year for a family. So the number's not huge, but the Jones Act is for the entire country, and it protects the entire country from an economic security and a national security standpoint. And so the Jones Act isn't the bad guy here. The Jones Act is part of the economic and national defense ecosystem of the country.
Right.
And we all pay something into that system in return for the benefits of a robust national economy and national sovereignty.
Very well said. And the other thing too, you must know this as well, having lived on the island, is also that northbound rate, right? Getting Puerto Rican products and Puerto Rican made goods into the mainland, you need that Jones Act trade route to move stuff back out. So that's another kind of aspect of that.
And Puerto Rico, they have a pharmaceutical industry, medical devices industry, and those goods need to get to the U.S. market. And one of the things that COVID revealed was, again, this is a challenge of a globalist economy where everything production always moves to the lowest cost place. We found we couldn't get the pharmaceutical medicines and devices that we needed. Rebuilding those aspects of Puerto Rico's economy would be a huge benefit to the United States writ large.
Yeah, I agree. All right. Well, before we close up, is there anything else you'd like our audience to know about the Jones Act, about the Coast Guard, about your work at America First Policy Institute?
What I'd say about the Coast Guard is, as we're on a recruiting upswing right now. We're also in the season where people are considering going to military academy. So I'll kind of make my pitch there. The Coast Guard's core values are honor, respect, and devotion to duty. And a former commandant of ours used to explain them as 3 concentric circles. Honor is about yourself. It's what you're willing to do. Respect, dealing well with others, your shipmates. And then devotion to duty, what you're willing to do for the American people. And what I tell folks is, whether it's in the Coast Guard or another service, if you give your full investment of those 3 things, you'll get back meaningful work, great teammates, an opportunity that you literally cannot predict. And again, walking across the White House lawn with the president as his Homeland Security advisor is just something a 17-year-old me, just could not foresee. But it was an opportunity presented by my service in the Coast Guard.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for your service to our country, for living those Coast Guard values, and for giving so much back to our nation.
Thank you. It was an honor and a privilege to serve, and I'm super happy to be with AFPI now, serving in a different way.
Great. great. Thank you so much. Appreciate having you on.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's all for this episode of the American Maritime Podcast. And we hope that our audience will share this show and also go to AmericanMaritimeVoices.org and sign up to be a voice on maritime issues. Again, that's AmericanMaritimeVoices.org. Check it out. Admiral Brown, thank you so much for being here with us today and for your service to this country. I'm Sada Fuentes, signing off.